and welcome to the 27th Annual Cleveland Jobs with Justice celebration. I'm Steve Holeko, a member of the Cleveland JWJ Steering Committee, and I just want to say at the outset, I have not been around for the previous 26 celebrations, but I'm guessing with the speaker we have for tonight that this is going to be among the best. Before we get started, I want to introduce the Director of Cleveland Jobs with Justice, Deb Klein.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I just wanted to do a little bit of some technical things for tonight. Everybody is on mute. Phil is going to talk about his book and his experiences for about a half hour. Then we're going to open it up to discussion, but you are going to need to raise your hand. Please use the raise your hand feature down below, so it puts you up in a queue. You can also put any questions that you may have in the chat, and Phil is welcoming all kinds of discussion and questions after his presentation. When Phil is done, we will be doing a drawing for two of his books. We're going to give away two books, The Jackson Project, War in the American Workplace. And then also we have 4 $50 Penzi gift cards. And one of the reasons why I thought it would be a good idea to give Penzis the business is because I'm sure you all know that they're getting pretty much harassed by the right because of their political ideation. So I thought it would be very fitting for them to be the recipient, or for us to give them business. So we will do that at the end. So there will be a total of 6 drawings, and I'm going to enter all of you into a wheel, and we'll do that when we wrap up. Okay, Steve.
We are proud to have union organizer, activist, and author Phil Cohen with us tonight. Phil left home at the age of 16 and then worked in blue-collar industries for about 20 years. He eventually became a chief steward for his union, and he also eventually developed unique skills at preventing union busting. Phil acquired a reputation as someone who could always deliver results in extreme conditions. While preventing decertification, he often got front-page newspaper coverage and TV coverage. Phil has been interviewed by Mother Jones, Voice of America, and Bloomberg. Phil also worked for the National Labor Relations Board. And while he was there, he helped establish precedent which defined what key elements of illegal union busting are. And this is very important when the legal process usually ensues after a decertification. Phil is also an author. One of the books he's going to talk about tonight is Fighting Union Busters in a Carolina Carpet Mill, which you can get at any bookstore, okay? But if you order it on Phil's website, you get a 40% discount, and it will be autographed. And Deb, I'm assuming you're going to put that website in the chat.
Actually, what I'm going to do is put all of that information in a follow-up email that will go out on Monday with the program and a link to the YouTube. So all of the links, the appropriate links, I will have to everybody by email on Monday, Tuesday at the latest.
Sounds good. And without any further ado, please welcome Phil Cohen.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the kind introduction. Just have to make one tiny little correction. I never worked for the National Labor Relations Board, but I presented many, many cases to them. I was a lead organizer for Workers United SEIU, which back in the day was the Clothing and Textile Workers Union, and we've been through more name changes in the last 30 years than some of the hippie girls I used to know. But we are now Workers United and an affiliate of SEIU. Before I start talking about my latest book, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes touching base about the National Labor Relations Board, even though Deb has told me that most, if not all of you, have your own experience and war stories dealing with them. There might be certain experiences that some people haven't had. And it's important to understand a couple of points for the rest of my presentation about the book to make sense. There's a difference between being involved in an NLRB case and investigating the case, putting the case together, and taking it home. And there are some things that happen behind the scenes and about the game that are important to understand if you haven't been there yourself. The NLRB, as probably most of you know, was started by FDR as a federal law enforcement agency to protect and guarantee the rights of working people to organize and unionize. And the NLRB enforces, as most of you know, the National Labor Relations Act. But what's interesting about that is that, like much federal legislation, there's a lot of space left for interpretation between the lines. A lot of the language is very, very broad. And so the NLRB also has its book of rules and regulations, which defines how the act is interpreted. How when the board takes action or doesn't take action, it is in some ways more responding to the rules of regulations, applying the act, than the act directly. And as you all know, the board is governed by a 5-person panel appointed by the President of the United States. And I've presented cases to every board since George Bush Sr. through Donald Trump. And while naturally you get an easier go of things when you have a Democratic administration, you have to jump through more hoops of fire with the Republican administration in order to make the same case. I've won cases before every administration. But in the book we're talking about here, in 1917, 1918, I was up against a Trump-appointed NLRB, which was like nothing I've ever encountered or dealt with before. My books are not intellectual manifestos. That's not me. I'm a street guy. I fought my way up from the streets of New York from nothing to be where I am. I did blue-collar work for 20 years, as we said during the introduction. So I write my books as action dramas. They're entertaining, they're fun to read, yet at the same time, they're packed with a great deal of information about how to put together a campaign when the odds are stacked against you and win. In November of 2017, I received a phone call from the union's Carolina director asking if I would be willing to be inserted into an 80-year-old union local in Eden, North Carolina, that was undergoing an illegal decertification drive from their employer. And I said, count me in. Unfortunately, this decert had been going on for almost the entire month the decert window was open. Unfortunately, sometimes unions are a bit penny wise, pound foolish. And they wanted to see if their lawyer 500 miles away in New York could put together a case and present it, which of course is impossible. Got to be have boots on the ground to investigate and put together an NLRB case. So I was sent in not just at the 11th hour, but 11th hour and 59 minutes. So I was called on a Friday night, and I spent that weekend on the phone with the executive board members, getting as much background and information from them as I could about the unfair labor practices driving this decertification drive. I spoke with the union's attorney, Ira Katz, on Monday morning. And he told me, very nonchalantly, that I had to have a case presented to the board at Winston-Salem office, Region 10, and along with an offering of proof, listing the witnesses and a paragraph or so about what they had to say in regards to each allegation, by that evening, or the board was going to schedule an election. And I said, how the hell am I supposed to do that? I don't even have boots on the ground yet. And he said, well, I don't know. Call the board, see what you can work out, which I did. And I spoke to a board agent, and I was given a whopping 36 hours to put together a strong enough case to block the election. So I arrived in Eden, North Carolina, which fortunately is less than an hour from where I live on Monday evening, so I had prior obligations on the day before, and began putting together a case. On the next day, I like to work in concentric circles. I like to send it in a timely manner. I like to get to know the committee, then get to know the steward structure, and then branch out to the membership. But this had to be all done in fast forward. I met with the committee, got them on board, explained what we were doing. That night, stayed up all night, putting together the case and the offering of proof. Had to fax it to the NLRB so that they had it when they got there at 8 o'clock in the morning the next day. And all of the hotel's office equipment was broken. But come hell or high water, I got it to them, and the election was blocked. But that's got us to first base. Then the challenge is actually getting the witnesses that I identified entirely through speaking with members of the committee to actually come forward and give a sworn affidavit to board agents. And that is sometimes easier said than done. With people who've never dealt with a federal law enforcement agency, who find the process intimidating, who think it's going to get them fired. And it's a process of meeting with folks one at a time that would have to first get approached by members of the committee to see if they were willing to meet with me at the Union Hall. And then explaining their rights and protections to them, which all of you know, including the confidentiality of affidavits. And with some, it was an easy sell. With some, it was a 2-hour explanation. But it was very, very clear as I began talking and meeting with witnesses that the company has really overplayed its hand. They were committing egregious violations out in the open. Supervisors were openly joining anti-union employees, twisting people's arms to sign the usurp petition. About 7 anti-union employees were essentially getting paid to have free run of the plant, signing signatures. And over a fairly short period of time, 3 key witnesses developed. There are 2 basic types of evidence, and people might give them different names. What I call them is just corroborative evidence, where you have a group of different people all talking about the same type of violation. And then there's the most powerful, which is cumulative evidence, where you have multiple witnesses describing the same incident. And it takes a combination of both to convince the board to issue a complaint on a major case. The 3 women in question all worked in the same department. None of them were members of the union. And so management saw them as a soft touch, easy to intimidate. And a department manager approached all 3 of them, sometimes within earshot of each other, trying to twist their arms to sign the petition. And while these were all not members of the union in a right-to-work state, they were just really indignant about the way they were getting pushed around. And so they came forward and they met with me. And it was pretty clear they were going to be the cornerstone in the case, around which we could kind of organize a much larger case with them at the center of it. They were the eye of the hurricane. But a lot of the drama in this part of the book is the process we had to go through with each of the witnesses, and especially what came to be known as the 3 girls, to actually get them to come forward and give an affidavit. Because most folks came down to the Union Hall thinking they would tell me and I would tell the NLRB, and that would be all there was to it. They didn't understand they would have to come with me to Winston-Salem and under oath give a statement. But over time, I began taking folks down to the board. And in the process, I never once in my life have sent a witness to the NLRB without being present. In part, it's a way to give people a last minute prep before they actually give their testimony, remind them of the key points. It's a way to help those who have the jitters. And more importantly, it's a way to be present and develop a relationship with the board agents, which is essential in making a case. Because, you know, I've never honestly really met a board agent or a board attorney that I didn't think was a nice, sincere person. And that's saying a lot given the extent of my experience. But they're overworked, underpaid government employees, and they will take shortcuts. And they will look for the easiest way to connect the dots unless there's somebody really staying on top of their every move. And knowing when it's necessary to file a position paper on a particular aspect of a particular allegation in order to get them to see it your way, and in some cases, writing a brief about an entire section of the case. As it approached the time when our star witnesses, the three girls, I hope nobody finds me sexist for calling them that, but that's what we called them at the time, to come forward, every day they changed their mind. Yes, I want to do it. No, I don't want to do it. I was really fortunate that the local union had a great vice president named Bill Pettigrew. This guy was a biker, wasn't really an outlaw biker, as he put it. He rode with a group called the Scorpions. They're a national organization. They party with the one percenters. They party with the Hells Angels and the Outlaws, but they're all working guys who are kind of weekend warriors. But this guy was really sharp. He really understood people, and he'd been out of the plant for a number of years on organizing drives. And so he was the one I had to send back to talk with the women who are having second thoughts and keep convincing them, you know, come down, meet with Phil. Okay, you met with Phil. It's okay, do this. No, don't change your mind. This is why we need you. And it was a long kind of, the $60,000 question was, will these three witnesses show up? Because trying to present this case and win it before a Trump-dominated NLRB, and those of you who were doing this during the time frame of the story know exactly what they were like. It was like walking on water. It was much easier said than done. Finally, it came down to, if the board agents come to us at the Union Hall, we will testify. But we will not go all the way up to Winston-Salem, take all day and get back at 9 o'clock at night, because we all have families, we all have kids, we all have to be at work 6 o'clock in the morning tomorrow, and we're just not going to go that far. And so I called up the board agent, and he said, I'm sorry, we don't have a budget to do that. We're not going to do it. Either they want to show up or they don't. So this is where having a union rep with relationships makes all the difference in a case. Because I called up the U.S. attorney supervising the case, who I had previously worked a major case with, and so we knew each other quite well. And I explained the problem. I said, I need these two agents to come down to Eden, North Carolina, or we are not going to be able to put on our case. And she cut me off after 30 seconds. She said, Phil, you got it. And I said, I don't want one agent, I want both agents. She said, no problem, you got it. So I pissed these guys off for a couple of days. They're professionals. They got over it. They came down. All three of the women gave outstanding affidavits. And we kind of were starting to get a leg up. The company had hired a notorious union buster whose name was Frederick Engelhardt. If I wanted to name a union busting attorney in a book, I could not come up with a better name than Frederick Engelhardt. And he adopted some very unusual tactics. He began right from the beginning. Once he realized that I was involved, it was not going to be him and management against the local union. He started writing briefs directly to the Trump-appointed NLRB in Washington. I'd never seen that before. Usually both parties deal with and brief the region. And if you get to the point where it goes to court, and then it's going to go before the full board, that is when you begin, briefing the board itself. But he was just bypassing the region. I was going straight to the board. And the board will only accept briefs from attorneys. The region will accept them from union reps if they know what they're doing and they have a reputation. So I had to get our attorney, Ira Katz, to start filing rebuttal briefs with the board. And what Frederick M. Engelhardt's strategy was very, very simple. He wanted to make the board hate my guts before the case ever got to them. He quoted excerpts from my book, out from the Jackson Project book, my first book, out of context. He had transcripts of every radio interview I was doing about the campaign at the time attached to his brief. And in the brief proper, again, having statements taken out of context. So they would see me as some absolute wingnut radical and just absolutely despise me before the case ever got to them, which was a pretty interesting tactic. And then several weeks into this, the attorneys for the National Right to Work Committee became involved as well. And they teamed up with Frederick Engelhardt because both parties saw this as an opportunity to set new precedent, to give the NLRB a case, which they had already announced they were looking for, to repeal the blocking charge policy, which I'm guessing most of you are aware is the policy that if the board files a charge during a decertification and is able to make a good prima facie case, the election is blocked until the charges are investigated. And repealing the blocking charge policy would mean the election would take place anyway, but then the votes would be sequestered and the local would be left in limbo while the charges were litigated, which divides and confuses the local. And the blocking charge policy has existed since 1935 when the board was created, but they both saw this as the precedent case, the case which would take them to a new level of the right-wing union busting brotherhood, if you will, if they could be the ones to make the case to repeal the blocking charge policy. So a portion of every brief was about that. And ultimately, after months of just bitter haggling, the scene inside the plant became very, very intense. But what I do in a long campaign, if you really want to keep people involved, you really want to keep them interested, you got to make it entertaining. You got to make it fun. You got to make it the greatest show to ever hit town. And so I'm very fortunate to live with a woman who is both the best copy editor I ever worked with. She's edited everything I've ever written, from briefs to books to articles. She's also an artist, and she's always drawn leaflet cartoons for my campaigns. And so she started drawing cartoons for my leaflets, cutting the anti-union people, cutting the management, sponsoring the case down to size in a very humorous way. We came up with a local like the no sign, as in no smoking, no guns, when this was no union busters. And we put them on t-shirts. And we had 2/3 of the people, even people who weren't union members, wearing them in the plant, which, among other things, is a real embarrassment to a company that constantly has customers, their lending institutions touring the plant. And the last thing that corporations are accountable to want to see is a labor dispute. Will a company be able to make its next debt payment if there's a strike or a labor dispute somehow interferes with production? Will the company make its next order shipment if the same thing happens? So we just had a perfectly legitimate, non-disruptive scene on the shop floor that had every dignitary to whom the company was accountable visiting the plant saying, "What the hell is with these t-shirts?" And what's that that cartoon looks like you. Why is it on this flyer? And so we created a very uncomfortable atmosphere for the company. And, I hate to give away the ending of a book, but the real drama here, obviously we won, or I wouldn't be here as your speaker, and I wouldn't have done all these, I wouldn't have a book if we'd lost. But the board ended up issuing an absolutely monster complaint. There were dozens of allegations citing specific members of management. And we were able to really rub the company's nose in the image of being an outlaw employer. And initially, the case was going to go to court. Our case was so strong, the company caved in, backed down, signed a settlement agreement, and very interestingly, without an admission of guilt clause. Normally, a settlement agreement contains a non-admission clause from both parties. But we got a settlement agreement without an admission of guilt. Without a non-admission of guilt. And I stuck around for a couple of years to rebuild the relationship. And what normally happens, what I've seen happen during one failed DCERT after another, because when companies send in professional union busters, the union sends in me. And I've never lost a DCERT case. I've never had a union locally certified on my watch. And what tends to happen is the management people who sponsored, whose brainchild was the decertification. Oh, it's no problem. These people are idiots. We do this, we do that. We hire a professional. We can get rid of the union. They end up getting fired because companies have zero tolerance for failure, especially when it ends up in public humiliation and bad press coverage. So people both locally and corporately who underwrote this illegal decertification campaign ended up getting fired. And the company did what normally happens in this case, which is they bring in people who have experience dealing with the unions, have a healthier attitude towards collective bargaining, which is, we meet each other in the middle and we find ways to work things out that everyone can work with. Because the last thing that's good for anybody, workers or management, is an ongoing dispute. They brought in people we could work with, and we went about rebuilding the union local. And so I'll close by saying this about the book. I want to briefly touch on a couple of other points before I open the floor. The book is available, as Deb said, wherever books are sold. The best place to get it is my website, which is fightingunionbusters.org. Very easy to remember, fightingunionbusters.org, where I am passing on my author's discount that I get from my publisher, McFarland and Company, to union supporters and union activists. So it's 40% off, signed copy, and I include a free CD of working class music because I'm also a recording artist and a songwriter. So it's a great package. And later on, when Deb briefly describes my first book, which is being given away as a door prize, if you're not one of the winners of the door prize and you're interested in both books, if you order 2 copies on my website, but in the little place on the ordering menu where you can leave a note, just write both books, and I'll know to send you one of each. For complicated technical snafus, which, as I told Deb, she could probably resolve in 5 minutes, but I couldn't if my life depended on it. My old book is still on my old website, and my new book is on my new website. But if you order 2 books from my new website, you get one of each, fightingunionbusters.org. At the time the book was released in 2020, it was current events because Donald Trump was still president. And the Trump-appointed NLRB, which was nothing short of professional union busters who had been hired to pull the teeth from the National Labor Relations Act, were running the show. I've never dealt with a board like this one. They were repealing one section of the rules and regulations after another that gave meaning, that gave enforceability to the National Labor Relations Act itself, including the blocking charge policy. They were repealing statutes I built my career enforcing. And fortunately, this decertification survived the repeal of the blocking charge policy, but it ultimately was repealed by the Trump-appointed board. Then Biden, God bless him, got elected. He appointed a new board, one member of whom was an old friend of mine named David Prouty, who used to be the general counsel for my union. We worked many cases together, and they reinstated the blocking charge policy and every other important regulation the Trump board has repealed. But 2 weeks from now, I'll tell you, I can't emphasize this enough. I'll tell you this, I'm a boots on the ground guy. Politics has never been my first, second, or third love. I find it dry and boring, to be really honest with you. But ever since Trump came on the scene, I've been taking it really seriously. He is the worst enemy of working people and organized labor. He is a poster child for corporate America. Working people like Trump because they identify with his tough guy image. But he is a daddy-bought rich kid who would at best be some corporate executive. He would not own his own business empire and have been a president or running for president of the United States if his father hadn't given him millions of dollars to stake him. He is not some tough guy. If he spent 5 minutes in the world I come from, he'd be pissing in his pants and crying for his mama. Okay? But he is a good actor. He understands how to organize around the lowest common denominator in people. And it is astounding how many really stupid, angry people there are in this country who buy into it, because most importantly, he validates everything about dysfunctional people that society, parents, school teachers have always made them feel bad about, have always, made them suffer consequences for. He validates their hatred. He validates their bigotry. He validates their rage. He validates their moral superiority. All of a sudden, you got a president and perhaps, a once and future president who will make them seem like the best people in the world, even though they're the worst people in the world. And that is the number one reason people identify with Donald Trump, because he validates the worst in them. And this election, the experts, people who know politics, say this is the closest election we're ever going to have. If Trump gets elected again, and important caveat, with a majority in both congressional houses. If he gets elected with a split Congress, they will cripple at least a good part of his agenda, just like Congress crippled a good part of Biden's agenda. But if he gets elected with a majority in both houses, mark my words, he will dismantle the labor movement. There'll be national right to work within a year. One way or another, they may very well just simply repeal the National Labor Relations Act. People like me could very well end up having a target on their back in 2 or 3 years down the road. He is the worst thing that can happen to working people. He is the worst thing that can happen to the labor movement. And nobody should just sit at home and think that, well, I'm only one vote. I live in North Carolina, where we're probably going to go red. But I'm going to vote on Monday, simply because there is no way, if you really know the score, not to vote against Donald Trump. And if every person here today can convince one more person the importance of voting against Trump, it's worth it, because the consequences of him getting elected are horrific. And the very last thing I'd like to share is to turn you on to a very exciting new nonprofit magazine about unions and workplace issues called Work Bites. And I'm writing a monthly column for them called War Stories, which is the same type of material that I have in my books. It's the stories of my campaigns. Done a couple of stories recently that go back to my rough and tumble days on the streets of New York, but it's all incidents that make for a short story length piece rather than a book length piece. You know, they're not situations that went on for 2 or 3 years. But I would suggest you check out the magazine, not just for my stories, but there's some really, really excellent reporting and work bites about underdocumented, but very, very important issues that affect the lives of working people today. So that said, I'm done. Floor's open.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Thank you very much, Phil. Or write it in the chat. Molly?
She's actually clapping.
Oh, okay.
But one of the
Thank you,
things that
Molly.
one of the things that I would like to do is to recognize a couple people that are on tonight. Two of our executive committee members are here, Larry Bresler and Salah Nolan. Salah is the chair of Cleveland Jobs with Justice, and then I'm gonna recognize one other person is Linda Hinton, who is the vice president of CWA District 4, which is also the home of Cleveland Jobs with Justice, and we've been there for I don't know how many years. Do you know how many years, Linda?
No, I don't.
It's been beyond both of our times.
20 years
So,
at least.
yeah. So thank you. We always have to thank and recognize Linda, and then, as I said, our two executive committee members. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they would like to discuss with Phil while we have him here?
My girlfriend is in the next room. She's got some good cooking recipes. I was wondering what that is.
Phil, I actually have. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Now, if you have a question, please do.
Well,
And
it's more of a comment that I'd like to ask you to comment.
Sure.
It seems like the overall union movement has made gains the last 4 years. The successful strikes, the number of workplaces seeking certification. If we get good results in 2 weeks, I'm just wondering if you think that will continue. I know what's going to happen if we don't.
Yes, I do think it will continue. I think it may even escalate, but here's something important. And it kind of led me into something that I was kind of saving in case there was some space to fill up. You talk about a lot of unions seeking certification or seeking a first contract. And they made a lot of headlines, and 1 year turns into the next and turns into the next, but they haven't gotten it. And from what, I'll tell you this, what it really takes to be an organizer in the tough situations, when you're dealing with hostile corporations, where you're outfunded, where you're outgunned, you have got to have a killer instinct. An organizer who's got boots on the ground in the worst situations has got to be more ruthless and more cunning than the union busters. They've got to have street smarts. Book smarts isn't enough, okay? Being someone who is a liberal and politically correct and went to college and wanted to save the working people is not going to prevail in a situation like that. You've got to be a cutthroat. It's kind of like the Old West, when a town is being exploited by, a gang of bank robbers. And then, the farmers try to fight them off themselves, and they all bring their shotguns, and every time they get cut to pieces. And finally, they're bringing a hired gun. They're bringing one guy who can stand up against the whole crowd. And in situations like this, an organizer has got to have a hired gun mentality. They've got to have the mentality of a street fighter, or they're not going to win. Because the people they're up against are so vicious and so cold-blooded and so absolutely devoid of compassion and honor. You have to be able to stand up to people like that, beat them at their own game, but do it for the right reasons. You got to be a street fighter, but at the same time, give a damn about people. You got to have heart. In some ways, I've said to people, coming from a rough background, I've always been, in my heart of hearts, I have always been an outlaw, but I use it for a good cause. I use it to fight for people who are where I've been. I'm fighting for people who are where I fought my own way out of. And I'm in a position to tell them with authority of my experience, look, guys, if you want to have a union, this is what you got to do. One of the things I've taught every committee I've worked with is how to be ruthless, but without hatred. That's the magic. That's what distinguishes a warrior from a soldier. Being ruthless, being a cutthroat, but without hatred. And
Phil, we
I think
do
it's-
have a question. We have a question in the chat. Is there anyone else who does what you do to continue this work? And that's from Ann Caruso.
who does what I do the way I do it? I hope so, but I haven't met him. You know, it's a reason why I had actually retired from full time, and the union called me back to handle the Mohawk campaign. And I had some health issues a little more than a year ago. I was in the hospital for a case of pneumonia that almost killed me. Surprised the hell out of me because I've always considered myself invincible. But I'm still getting my strength back. When I do, I'm going to put my shingle back out there and be available to do more of this, because this is what I do.
And I've given you all, you can unmute yourself. So if somebody wants to unmute and just ask a question or speak up. Go ahead, Kathy. Kathy, go ahead.
First, I have to unmute myself, and then I can
Okay.
even take my video back if I figure out where the heck that went. Hi, Phil. Thank you. Very interesting presentation, and I look
Thank you,
forward to
Kathy.
reading your book. And I went looking for your website, and I couldn't find it.
Let me say, Fighting Union Busters, one word, lowercase, fightingunionbusters.org.
And as I said in the beginning, I will send out all the appropriate links for everyone, Phil's website, where you can get the books, and Work Bites, because Work Bites is a little bit more difficult to find, but I'll send all of those links out to everyone in the follow-up meeting.
And also, if you Google the title, like the second thing that shows up on the page is going to be my website.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll wait for, I'm sure Deb will get me the right link. Thank you.
Okay.
I will, I promise. We do have another question in the chat, and then Bob Parker. First, Thalia asked if for someone looking to potentially work as a union attorney, which is really good. She's also an intern with us and Organize Ohio. What skills and attributes most helps the good cause?
You're saying, and you want me to address this as someone who wants to be a union attorney?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I mentioned some of them a few minutes ago. You've really got to be street smart. Being book smart is not enough. I mean, yeah, you got to understand the National Labor Relations Act and just cause, blah, blah. You got to be street smart. You've got to sense what your enemy is going to do before they know they're going to do it. You've got to be willing to come after people with be absolutely bloody minded how you go after people. You have to target members of management, understand their weaknesses, turn them into a liability against their employers. The same way they target workers, you have to know how to target management. You have to teach your good people, your leaders in the local, how to do the same thing, or at least provide you with intel so you can do it. But this is not a game for the faint-hearted. It is not a game for intellectuals. You know, and you have to understand, this is the most important thing. You got to understand what your people really care about. And I got to say this, Donald Trump is a brilliant organizer for a bad cause. He uses his gift in a bad way, but he understands what his people really care about. And you got to understand what the people in your local really care about. And folks in industrial, of course, there are, more high-end unions, like doctors and airline pilots and railroads. the people who work in industrial settings, they live week to week, month to month. What they care about are things that affect their lives now. They don't care about politically correct doctrine. They don't have an expansive sense of worldview. They care about their guns. Okay, you might not want to hear this, okay? They care, they think, I've run into a lot of people, and good people, even local officers, who think the Democrats are going to take away their guns, and their guns are really important to them. You got to understand that matters to them. You got to understand that what you're there to do is teach people how to be your brother and sister's keeper within the context of building a strong local union. You do not preach to them about other things that you think are right and they should know. I have sat and I have listened to people run off at the mouth about, is it more effective to beat your child with a belt or with a switch? And I just listen. I certainly don't agree with it, but I just listen. Anybody ever laid a hand on a child hours responsible before they wake up in the damn hospital? And that's a natural fact, but I just listen, okay? I've heard people talk. I remember one guy talked to me at the plant gate handing out leaflets in the middle of the night for 45 minutes about how AIDS was God's wrath upon homosexuals. I didn't agree with him. I didn't disagree. I listened. Because by disagreeing, I was not going to change his mind. All I was going to do was alienate him when I'm trying to build a local union to fight a hostile employer. You have to organize people around their values, not around your values. Not because you went to college and you read this book and you know more, so you're going to teach them your values and organize around that. You got to organize people around their values. You got to understand what they care about. You don't got to agree with things you don't believe in, but you can't put them down for or try to change them either, because your job is to turn them into good trade unionists.
So we have a question from Bob Parker, and then I'll get to yours, Brian, in the chat. Go ahead, Bob.
Hey, this is more of an announcement. I'm going to put something into the chat.
Okay. And then from Brian, we have, without criminal penalties, how can we get multinationals like Amazon, Starbucks, and Walmart to respect the representational rights of workers? Most of them think of defying labor law as a negligible cost of doing business.
And you're right. Look, one time, right after Clinton got elected and appointed Elliott Gould to head the NLRB, I got to give a presentation standing on the stage at a conference next to Elliott Gould, talking about my experience with the NLRB. And I said, look, the penalties, the NLRB has some good regulations about what companies can and can't do, but it's like if someone was arrested for being a crack dealer, and their penalty was they had to post notice on their door for 60 days saying, I will never again sell crack in the neighborhood. And on the 61st day, they're back in business. So that is true, but it is what it is, and we are not going to change that. We can complain. I like to say I'm about solutions, not about problems. Okay, so the solution is you've got to find ways to draw blood from these companies. You've got to find their weak underbellies. You got to wage asymmetric warfare. You've got to think like a guerrilla fighter. Every company and every executive at a company has their weaknesses, has their vulnerabilities. You got to figure out how to cut one of them out from the herd, like a leopard, and go after that one person and turn them into a liability. You've got to figure out how to divide and conquer within the ranks of management, like they divide and conquer within the ranks of workers. It's what I mean about being ruthless. And what I've seen of many of the organizers who are leading the campaigns that were just mentioned, they don't have enough of those qualities.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you guys for coming tonight, and look forward to seeing you at various activist events over the next year and a year from now at the 28th annual JWJ celebration.